It wasn't one. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's webinars, co-hosted by SASE Nationals and the Colorado School of Mines. My name is Susan Tran, and I will be your moderator for tonight. Tonight's webinar is titled From Concept to Orbit, the Life Cycle of a Science Satellite. A NASA science satellite mission starts out as a need for specific science information, but the path that takes that science need to a piece of flight hardware performing world-class observations is complex, deliberate, and involves diverse teams of engineers, scientists, and technicians. It is, well, rocket science. In this webinar, we'll discuss the different phases of mission development from science concept through design, analysis, integration, and test, launch, and on-orbit operations. As a specific example, we'll follow the recent NASA Goddard mission, the Solar Dynamics Observatory, from the early design phases to HD images of the sun you can watch on YouTube. Tonight's presentation will be presented by Jeff Bolognese, who is currently the branch head of Mechanical Systems Analysis and Simulation Branch at NASA's Goddard Spaceflight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland. Jeff graduated from the University of Michigan in 1988 with an undergraduate degree in Aerospace Engineering. He joined Goddard right after graduation and has worked there for almost 25 years. Over the course of his career, he's provided structural analysis support for NASA missions such as the Upper Atmosphere Research Satellite, the Earth Observation Satellite System, ISAT, and most recently the Solar Dynamics Observatory. When he's not doing rocket science, Jeff enjoys hiking, cooking, and spending time with his wife Cindy and his children Nathan and Evie. And now, without further ado, I present to you Jeff.
All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining in today. I'm going to start by sharing my presentation here and get that going. I want to thank SASE for inviting me to do this presentation. I have been associated with SASE for a couple of years now, and I've really been impressed with the enthusiasm and dedication of the people, and so I'm thrilled that I can present this presentation for you guys. So as Susan said, my name is Jeff Bolognese. I'm branch head at the NASA Goddard Spaceflight Center, and NASA Goddard, I think some of you were able to visit us when you came out for the National Convention in October. Goddard is one of NASA's premier centers for Earth science and space science. And so pretty much any picture of space that you've seen, picture of the Earth that you've seen taken from space, was probably taken by a Goddard satellite. Goddard also manages the Hubble Space Telescope, as well as being the chief center for developing the James Webb Space Telescope, which is the follow-on to the Hubble Space Telescope. Goddard has about 10,000 employees that pass through the gate every day, both civil servant and contractors, and is probably one of the largest centers, one of the largest facilities in the United States that has scientists and engineers dedicated to Earth science and space science. So today what I thought I'd do is I'd talk a little bit about how we go from the concept of a space mission to the actual hardware. Now typically when you think of NASA science satellites, what comes to mind is really probably the hardware, like the Hubble Space Telescope or the Curiosity rover, or the cool images that you see that come out of those missions. But what we're going to talk about today is how you get from the brilliant idea to get this science to those cool images and that hardware that's taking those cool images. So what we're going to talk about today is to take a look at how we go from those initial ideas to the final project. As I said, we see those final projects, but we don't usually see how they start. We'll also see that all mission development follows the same deliberate progression, and what we're going to do in this presentation is we're going to discuss the various phases of a project development and what happens along the way. I'll give you one caveat though, that since my background is in structural analysis, this presentation is going to have a decidedly mechanical engineering bias. So if you were to discuss this with other engineers or scientists, they might have a slightly different perspective on this process. All right, so what does the NASA project lifecycle look like? This is it in a nutshell. This is taken from the Systems Engineering Handbook and it kind of outlines the overall phases, and we break them into multiple phases, and we letter code them. So we have pre-phase A, which are concept studies. We have our preliminary analysis phase in phase A, and the definition phase in phase B. The design phase and development is D, and on. You see these little triangles here. These represent various milestones within the project. Most of them are reviews, and we'll talk a little bit about that more. Now, some things to note about this, other than the alphabet soup of reviews and various things that are within this, are that even though this covers the overall life of a mission, the various subsystems of that mission are also going to follow this cycle, but may be on a different schedule. So for instance, if you have a spacecraft, a mission that has instruments on it, the instruments on that mission may lag or precede the spacecraft, but they're going to follow the same progression. And although the order of these phases is set, the lengths of the phases are not set. So you'll notice there's no time specifically mentioned on there. The relative sizes are probably about right. But if you have a very small satellite or a small mission, this entire phase from A to D can take maybe a year or two. Whereas if you're talking about a really large mission like a JWST, that can literally take decades to go from that first phase to the last phase. All right, so let's look at an example to demonstrate this. And as Susan mentioned, we're going to talk about the Solar Dynamics Observatory. This one is near and dear to my heart because it was the last real NASA mission, last project that I worked on hands-on as an engineer before I went into management. SDO is NASA's first mission in the Living with a Star program, and that's intended to be a series of satellites that are going to take a look at how the Sun and the Earth interact with each other. Specifically, SDO is going to study how solar activity is created and how space weather comes from that activity. It has 3 science instruments, and we'll look a little bit more in detail on those in a bit. They are the Atmospheric Imaging Assembly, the EUV Variability Experiment, and EUV is Extreme Ultraviolet. We like acronyms in NASA, and when you have an acronym within an acronym, then you know you've done a really good job. The Helioseismic and Magnetic Imager, HMI. And just to give you an idea of scale, the full observatory is about 4.5 meters tall or long, and 2.2 meters wide, and 6.25 meters wide, and that's with the solar arrays and the antennas deployed. And I think that's probably from antenna tip to antenna tip. And the total mass when we launched SDO was about 3,000 kilograms, though a large portion of that was really actually fuel. And it launched on February 11th, 2010. Actually remember that day very well because we were snowed in. Actually, Goddard was closed on that day because we had about 3 feet of snow on the ground. Now, before we get going, some nomenclature, or as I like to call it, how to sound like a rocket scientist. The SDO Observatory is broken into 3 separate modules. We have the instrument module on top, and that's the structure that holds the instruments, and then the actual instruments themselves. The spacecraft bus, and the solar arrays are attached to that, and the spacecraft bus contains all of the electronics, the attitude control systems, all those sorts of things, and then the propulsion module, which contains the support structure for the tanks, the main engine and the thrusters, and then the high gain antennas, which are used to communicate back to Earth, are also attached to the propulsion module for SDO. When we put all those pieces together, that's what we call the observatory. And a little bit more nomenclature. This is SDO in the stowed configuration. This is what it would look like when it's launched. So the solar arrays are down, the high gain antennas are locked up, and all the instruments are closed. When we get on orbit and deploy it, the solar arrays are released, the high gain antennas released, and then the instrument covers are opened up. And that's what we call the deployed configuration, or the on-orbit configuration. All right, so what happens in these various phases? The first phase is called pre-phase A, and this is really the very beginning of a mission. What's happening here is overall mission design. What are the goals of the mission? You're doing some very, very preliminary conceptual studies. Basically what they're trying to do here is make the case that this mission should go forward. Because in a lot of cases when you're in pre-phase A, you haven't been fully funded yet. You're really just a study. So you're looking at the very highest order mission requirements, what are the driving requirements to accomplish the science goals, that sort of thing, and some really early kind of broad architecture trade studies. what are the various kinds of ways that we can tackle this particular problem. From there, we go on to the preliminary design phase, and I've kind of lumped these together, A and B, just because they tend to kind of smear together in a real project. So what's happening in this phase? This is where you're really getting the refinement of the mission requirements and how they flow down to the hardware. Your interfaces are defined, how your instruments attach to your hardware, how the various modules attach together. And then you do some specific trades to start to optimize your design, because you're starting to get a little more information on what your detailed requirements are. You can start doing that. And you'll do some preliminary analysis against the environmental and performance requirements. So you're looking at really basic things like, can the structure meet the launch requirements in terms of strength and stiffness, what the loads that are going into it from launch, and then will the structure be able to meet on-orbit performance goals? When you see the changes in temperature, when you see dynamic excitation from the solar rays moving, that sort of thing, are you within your budgets there? And that's when your preliminary design is established. This is a design where you think it may not be complete, it may not have all the details sketched in, but it's going to meet most of your design goals and most of your science requirements, and you can start doing the more detailed design. And this culminates in what we call the preliminary design review, or PDR. That was one of the little triangles that you saw in that earlier diagram showing the various phases. All right, so first a few words about reviews. As you recall, we had a bunch of these little triangles scattered throughout the life cycle of a project, and these are really sort of key points where engineering peers as well as management types look at the project to make sure it's where it should be. Then generally the reviews that the engineers present at are presentations to peers, and sometimes we bring in outside organizations to help sort of get a fresh set of eyes on what's going on. And as I said, these are set at critical points in the mission when you're about to make major decisions on your schedule and your cost. And they offer opportunities really to make sure that the project is on track. Now, what's really important to point out is that these are not adversarial processes. This is not you defending your design, although it kind of seems like that sometimes. And it's been my experience that the result of a good review is a better design that's more likely to succeed. That doesn't make it any less nerve-wracking, but it's really critical to making sure that you have the greatest chance of mission success, because you're bringing in all these other people who have a lot of combined years of experience and can help make the mission better. And I'll show you a little bit example of what that looks like later on. All right, so as I said, there's a lot of design trades and analysis that goes on in the phase A-B cycle. Let's see what some of those look like. The top row here you're looking at is the various configurations that SDO went through from phase A to that PDR. So just to give you an example of the time scale, this image here was the design of SDO in March of 2002, and this image here is what it ended up looking like at PDR December of 2003. So a little shy of 2 years, and you've got 6 major configuration changes. This is an example of that instrument module and some of the trades that were done there. And you'll note also, not only do you see the shape of these changing, you see the instruments changing. One of the challenging things with SDO was that when we were designing it in these early phases, we didn't know what the suite of instruments was going to be. We guessed. We knew what the prime ones might be. But the instruments were also competing for space on SDO. So we had to kind of guess. We had to try to package the ones we thought were going to be the most difficult to package. And those instruments themselves were going through various design iterations. Like I think this instrument here, you can't see it very well. I think this is what AIA used to look like early on in the project. And then finally, here's an example of some of the analyses that go on. So here's showing some of the structural models for the optical bench. Just demonstrating some of the trades we went through with that. This is a kind of a stress plot of the spacecraft bus. This is a simplified model of the propulsion module, and then here we're looking at the dynamics of the overall system. Now, one of the interesting things, one of the reasons why you see such dramatic changes in the spacecraft is that when we were doing the initial designs here, we were designing for a relatively small launch vehicle, a mid-sized launch vehicle, what we call a Delta II launch vehicle. It became clear relatively early on that we weren't going to fit in one of those, and so we were given the green light to move up to a larger class of launch vehicle, an Atlas V or a Delta IV, and so that's when the design really changed significantly and we came to this point here. All right, now we move into phase C and D. This is where the design is getting finalized. So the final analyses are being completed to show that all requirements are met. The drawings are starting to be signed and released, and phase C culminates in what we call the critical design review. So at this point, once you reach that critical design review, what you're essentially getting is the thumbs up to start building the flight hardware. At this point, you're supposed to have about 70 to 80% of your drawings completed and signed off, and you should be ready to go into the integration and test phase. So at that point, parts are manufactured and integrated, and components are tested to all the anticipated environments. And for us, that means that we're testing them for the thermal environment, testing them under vacuum. We're looking at the dynamic loads and static loads, acoustic loads, electromagnetic loads, basically any kind of environment that we think we're going to see during launch and once we get into space. And those tests are done at both the component level and then they're done at the full integrated level. And at the component level, we usually test things a little bit harder and a little bit higher levels than we do at the full observatory level because it's always easier to fix something if you break it when it's not integrated to the full observatory. So if you want to break something, you break it at the lowest level possible so that you have the greatest amount of capability to fix that, and it also takes the least amount of time and the least amount of resources. So once you've done all your component testing, then you integrate them all into your flight unit, and then you do your acceptance testing of the full observatory, and phase D culminates in launch. This is an example of what the final design and analysis look like from phase CD. These are actually taken from our critical design review package. So up here we're showing what the instrument module looked like at PDR and then what it looked like at CDR. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later on. You'll notice that there's a lot more detail in the models now. By this point, we actually done some testing, so we've correlated our models a little bit, and you're seeing more complex analyses. This is showing one of the mode shapes on orbit, what happens to the structure as it's excited in its fully deployed configuration, and that's really useful for the attitude control folks so that they can help point the spacecraft where it needs to be. This is showing I think a thermal distortion run. So this is a very exaggerated look at what happens to the structure when the temperature increases, and you can see the peak temperature here is about 35 Celsius. This is a more detailed stress analysis of the spacecraft bus, and then you can see there's a lot more detail now in the propulsion module. And that's just an example of one of the types of drawings that you would get out of this. Now, one of the things I wanted to point out here, I talked about how the design cycle, the review cycle that is, helps to improve the product. And this is an example of it. It's kind of a small one, but since I was involved in the instrument module, it meant a lot to me. This is the model, or what the structure looked like at our PDR. The instrument module is basically a box. It's got lightweighting holes here, and then the instruments mount to these surfaces that don't have those holes. This is what it looked like at PDR. Now at CDR, you'll see there's a lot more detail here. The various inserts that we needed to attach the instruments are all in place and have been analyzed at this point. And you'll also notice that there's these slight little bump outs here on the bottom panel where the flexures, these are the things that connect the instrument module to the spacecraft module, where those connect. It was suggested at PDR that we put that little notch out there so that the center of these flexure blades would line up with the panels here to stiffen the load, reduce the stresses, and that's what we did. And it did, in fact, make a better product. So that's just one tiny example of how that review process results in a better product. All right, now let's take a look at integration. So we've tested all our components, and now it's time to put them together. What does that look like? Well, first here we're seeing the propulsion module for SDO being assembled, and these are actual photos of the assembly. You can see the prop module, and you can see the tank there. Next, we have the spacecraft bus. As I said, the spacecraft bus contains all the electronics. It also has a lot of what we call the reaction wheels, and that are used to steer the spacecraft essentially. But all that are in here, and you can see the harnessing and other cables that are in there. Here we see the instrument module on top of the spacecraft bus with the solar arrays here. This is the instrument module without the instruments attached. The instrument module is made out of honeycomb panel structures with composite face sheets, which is why it looks black like that. This is before the instrument module was blanketed. So you'll see in our next picture here with the fully integrated SDO, you see the high gain antennas on here, you see the AIA instruments here, and the other two instruments are on the back here, and you see the silver stuff all over it. This is thermal blanketing. This helps to keep the temperature as uniform as possible because we want to avoid large temperature swings that might cause this overall structure to deform or possibly break. So that's what it looks like when it's fully assembled. Next phase, and the last phase before we ship, is testing. Here's a picture of SDO being lowered into the Space Environmental Simulation Chamber, the SES chamber. This is the really big thermal vacuum chamber that we have at Goddard. And for those of you who took the tour, I'm sure you remember this. So it's kind of bundled up here. It's wrapped up because at this point we're in the flight observatory configuration. It's got all its various sensitive instruments on it, and so we need to protect it from contamination. So it's bagged with this mylar to keep dust and debris and other things off of it. Now here's SDO inside the SES chamber with the solar arrays deployed, and you can see the instruments here uncovered. These are the other two instruments. This is HMI and this is EVE, and this is our star trackers. In the Space Environmental Simulation Chamber, they've deployed the solar arrays, and they can basically test everything out. They'll pump it down to a vacuum, and then they'll cycle it through the temperature ranges that they think the spacecraft's going to see, and then they'll try to operate it. They'll deploy the solar arrays, or they'll deploy the high gain antennas. They'll run some of the electronics. This is also a way that the thermal engineers calibrate their models and make sure that they are accurate as well. Next step is the vibration test, and this is SDO being lowered into our vibration chamber. This is the interface with the spacecraft, or simulator for that actually. So this is brought down, it's bolted to a vibration table where we shake it, and we shake it to simulate the kind of dynamic environments that we expect to see during launch. And at this point we've done more severe tests on SDO, so we know that it's strong enough to take this, and this is really what we call an acceptance test. It's a test to make sure that we put everything together right and that we didn't have any surprises when we did that. One of the other tests that's done is an EMI test. So this is an electromagnetic interference test, and this is the EMI chamber here. And this is a test where the observatory is subjected to the kind of electromagnetic fields that they expect to see, to make sure that those aren't going to interfere with the instruments, and then also to make sure that the actual electromagnetic fields from the spacecraft itself don't interfere, cross-interfere with itself. And then finally, the end of phase D is launch. Now, normally, for most parts, a structural analyst, once the payload is shipped to the Cape and is loaded up and launched, that's generally the end of our job. However, for SDO, this is a good example of how the mechanical analysis work actually can continue after launch. So SDO got onto orbit, and one of the things it does is that it has its own main engine, and so once it gets into low Earth orbit, it uses its own main engine to get to the science orbit. When they tried to do that for the first time with SDO, they had a propellant sloshing issue. What was basically happening is that the propellant inside the tank, when they tried to fire it, would slosh around. The attitude control system would have trouble dealing with that and would shut down that burn. And this video here isn't quite accurate because it kind of just shows the rocket putting SDO in the absolute perfect orbit without that burn. They tried to figure out how they were going to deal with that. They had come up with a plan to use SDO's smaller thrusters to get them into orbit, but one of the problems with that is it was going to take a long time for them to do that. So the structural analyst, who had a model of SDO that he had built for the on-orbit configuration, was able to run that model to help the attitude control folks understand what was happening with the sloshing. And as a result of that, they were able to sort of change the way they did that main thrust, burn on their engines in such a way that they could fire it and get to their orbit just a few days later than they normally would have planned to do. So that was one case where the mechanical engineer, structural analysis in particular, was needed all the way through phase D, all the way through the launch cycle. And we're seeing also with some of the more advanced spacecraft that we have, like James Webb Space Telescope, that are relying extremely heavily on structural analysis, that we'll probably see more of that, where the structural analysis models are actually verified on orbit and are used for predicting the behavior while the actual spacecraft is on orbit. And there's the beauty shot of SDO looking at the sun with the Milky Way in the background, which you probably wouldn't be able to see in real life. All right, phase E. This is when the mission is actually conducting its science. So first light images for SDO, and first light is those first images from the telescope. Those were released on April 21st of 2010, which means that SDO is just now starting its 4th year of a 5-year mission. Odds are that the mission will continue beyond 5 years. One of the things that we have found at NASA is that we generally build our hardware to the point where it lasts a lot longer than we initially planned for it to do. Think of those Mars rovers that are still working years and years after they were launched, and they were only anticipated or only planned to work for about 6 months. So since that time, SDO has provided lots of insights into the working of the sun and really kind of revolutionized our understanding of the sun. And those discoveries hopefully will enable scientists to be able to predict major solar events. And those solar events, those huge solar coronal mass ejections and solar flares, can damage satellites, they can endanger astronauts, and in really severe cases they can knock out power grids. So understanding that space weather is really critical. What's probably going to happen is that the discoveries of SDO are likely going to lead to new questions about how the sun works, and then ultimately pave the way for the next generation of solar observing satellites, and then this entire cycle will begin again. So, case in point, back in 1998, I worked on a small explorer. This is a very small payload called TRACE, the Transition Region and Coronal Explorer. This was going to take some high-definition images and movies of how coronal mass ejections and solar flares form in the corona of the sun. That telescope that you see here in the middle of TRACE, that actually became the telescopes that were used here in SDO. So each one of these 4 telescopes is this big. I remember going to the review for the AI instrument and seeing a drawing that was to scale of these instruments and saying, you know, so these are what, twice the size that they should be? And then I realized that these instruments are actually the older siblings, the younger siblings rather, of the TRACE telescope. So and instead of taking a fraction of a picture of the sun, which is what TRACE did, SDO takes an entire full disk image of the sun. And likely what's going to happen, as I said, that those discoveries, those technical successes and the scientific discoveries from SDO will likely lead to that next brilliant idea for how to get more information about our sun and how to better predict what's going to happen on the sun, and hopefully give some NASA engineers, maybe some future engineers such as yourselves, some really interesting work to do in the not too distant future. So that's my presentation. I'm going to now open the floor to any questions that you guys might have. So fire away.
Okay, so at this time, does anyone from Mines have any questions for Jeff? Yes.
Okay, so I guess I'm curious as to how they make a decision about how they say this is the final design, because if the instruments are not decided, then the design can't be finalized, and then you can't really decide which instruments can fit on it if the design hasn't been finalized. So how do they end that cycle?
Okay, so the question is, for those of you at home who didn't hear, how is the final design decided upon? But,
Yeah.
okay.
Right. So early on in the process, when you're still kind of working out what the overall requirements are. So when we went into PDR with SDO, like I said, we didn't really know what the final instrument suite were going to be. So we actually had to make some educated guesses there. And by that, what we did is we might look at, what are the instruments that had the largest footprint, that were the heaviest, that were going to require the most resources, and try to design to those, but also include enough flexibility in our design that if we had to change it, we could. By the time we got to CDR, those were all set. We knew what they were going to be. There might have been some slight changes that occurred after that, but at that point we really had those suites nailed down. But early on in the process, yeah, it is tricky. You tend to kind of hedge your bets a little bit. Early on, we didn't know what launch vehicle we were going to use, and the environments for the launch vehicles can be different. And so what we had to do is sort of envelope those environments and analyze and do our resource analysis to that envelope, which means that we ended up with a project was maybe a little more conservative than we needed. But those are the trades you have to do. And frequently there are still, even after that, you get some late in the game changes and you have to modify your design. But you hope that you put enough flexibility in your design that you can accommodate them.
So I've heard previously that a lot of the times in the sort of space industry, there will be a project or a design that goes through, multiple phases of engineering, and it gets redesigned multiple times and could go on for, say, 30 years and sometimes never actually yield a product, or never, I don't want to say never go anywhere, but never get fully finished. Do you see that a lot, or not as much?
So the question was, oftentimes in the industry there are projects that go on for 30, 40 years. So do you see that a lot at Goddard?
I have to say that's not typical for NASA, and that's primarily because we just don't have the resources to do that. And private industry has funding for research and development stuff. We don't have quite as much of that. So generally speaking, if a project is funded, it will continue to a certain point. Now there are times where a project will get far enough along, something is going seriously wrong with the design or something, and it will get canceled. We've seen that happen before. There's also occasionally times where the political winds will change, and that will result in a project being canceled. For instance, a project that Goddard worked on back in the end of the 90s and 2000 was a project called Triana. Triana was actually a mission that was initially conceived of by Vice President Al Gore. It was going to be a satellite that would provide real-time video of the Earth to anyone on the planet, and then there was also some additional science that was being done there. That mission was actually built. The hardware was qualified. It was going to fly on the shuttle, and there was an administration change, and the new administration, the Bush administration, decided they didn't want to fund that. And so that spacecraft, that fully qualified spacecraft, was no longer in use. It ended up being put in storage essentially until years and years later they took it out of storage, refurbished it, and are now preparing it for another mission. So you do see sometimes technical reasons can cause cancellations, but you also sometimes see political reasons why certain projects get canceled. But that's one of the challenges of being a government organization.
All right, and for those of you at home who have questions, please just type your questions in the comments and we will get to them. Anyone else here have a question? Okay, I guess we'll open up the floor to our audience at home. Any questions?
The thousands and thousands of viewers.
Okay, how large was the team that worked on SDO?
SEO was, I would say it was a moderate-sized team. I can speak specifically for the structural analysis team. There was probably about, I think, 6 to 8 of us on there doing structural analysis. And you can kind of multiply that times the various other subsystems. So you probably had several dozen people who were working on it at any one time. And those teams kind of change as the phases go along. So for instance, the integration and test team, they don't really come on until you reach that point. So they don't get turned on until relatively late in the mission. And by that time, your designers have pretty much left. So you kind of get fluctuations in the team. But I think for SDO it was probably a few dozen or so. For really large missions like JWST, there's probably, I don't know, I want to say there's probably hundreds of people who are working on JWST because it's such a complicated mission. It's an international mission, and there's just a massive amount of work required, not just for the spacecraft, but also working on the infrastructure and the test equipment, everything that's going to support it. So very large missions will have hundreds of people probably. I suspect like the space shuttle and space station probably had hundreds and hundreds of engineers, maybe even more than that once you count all of the contractor support and people who feed into that.
As an entry-level engineer, what responsibilities could one expect?
Generally speaking, when you're an entry-level engineer and you're still kind of learning the ropes, at least within NASA, we all work on is flight projects. So you would be assigned to a flight project. It might be performing, doing an analysis or doing the engineering work for a subcomponent under the tutelage of a more senior engineer. And then as you learn the ropes there, you're given more responsibilities. Kind of the ideal situation, at least at NASA, is that a junior engineer gets to work on a flight project and one that allows them to see the entire life cycle of the project, because your roles and responsibilities change as the life cycle changes. And then gradually, as you gain more experience, you get more overall responsibility. You're more autonomous. You don't need quite as much oversight. And then your responsibilities increase as well. But initially, we have our entry-level engineers jump right in to working on flight hardware. And in fact, we have even our co-ops and our interns will frequently be working on flight projects. We're not just going to let them loose. Here, take care of this flight hardware. But we make sure that they have the guidance they need, because that's what you're going to learn, because you're not going to come out of college really knowing how to do structural analysis on a spacecraft, or how to do a test, or how to design spaceflight hardware. You might have the knowledge of the tools, but the processes and those sorts of things are something that you have to learn through the experience of actually working on flight projects.
All right, our next question is, how many different projects would a typical engineer work on? Are engineers focused based on discipline or by project/initiative?
Oh, that's a good question. And the number of projects that an engineer works on will depend on the type of engineer that they are. The way it would work at Goddard is typically most engineers who are general engineers are going to be dedicated to a single project. So structural analysts in my branch, most of them are dedicated to a single project, and they'll kind of linearly go through projects. So you might be on one project for 4 or 5 years, and then you go on to the next project. There are certain types of engineers who are discipline experts. For instance, one of the types of analysis that our branch has to do is acoustic analysis. It's a very specialized analysis set. It's not something that a project needs a dedicated person to do, but it's something that every project needs. So our senior vibroacoustic analyst works on pretty much every project at the same time. Right now, in fact, I had a meeting with him today, and he was kind of concerned that he was coming up on a situation where there were 2 major flight projects that were about to do vibroacoustic testing, and then a couple knocking on his door. So he might work simultaneously on 3 or 4 projects. But generally speaking, an engineer will dedicate their time to a single project at a time. But over the life of their career, they, depending on the size of the projects they're working on, they could work on a dozen or more projects. It really depends.
Alrighty, our next question is, why was Goddard where it is in Maryland? What is so unique about that location?
That's a good question. My gut feeling on that is that Goddard is located where it is because that was a huge swath of government land. If you ever go to Goddard, you'll notice that we are right up against the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center and not too far from the Patuxent National Wildlife Refuge. So I suspect that Goddard was put there in part because of its proximity to Washington, D.C., and there are also a number of other organizations in the area, that the Naval Research Labs and other organizations that have that same kind of role. But I think Goddard is where it is primarily because that's where the government land was and where the government could build stuff. But it is a very nice place.
Okay, we have a question from an audience member here. Go ahead.
So I assume that the satellites aren't actually being launched from Goddard. So if that is the case, then at what point are the satellites built up until they are shipped to where they're actually going to be launched from?
So at what point are these satellites built up until they are shipped to where they will be launched? Is that,
yeah.
Okay.
All right. For the most part, the satellites are built to their full launch configuration. So the only thing that's probably not in them when they ship is possibly the propellant, if they have propellant. But generally they are in their flight configuration, and shipping them is extremely challenging. You can't just call up UPS and have them deliver your satellite somewhere. Most of the time they're taken in very specialized shipping containers. They're taken by trucks. They're taken by really large cargo planes. Sometimes they're taken by barge even. JWST, which I keep talking about, will actually be shipped by boat. It's going to be launched from French Guiana, and so it'll actually come from, the final testing will be on the West Coast. It'll be loaded onto a ship, and it will go through the Panama Canal and go all the way down to French Guiana for its launch. It becomes a challenge because we have to, we design for our launch loads, but we also have to design for those transportation loads as well. And so when you're doing your analysis, you're not only just analyzing for what's the launch environment, you're also analyzing for what if I hit a pothole on I-95 when I'm shipping this. Sometimes those types of load cases can actually be drivers for parts of the design. But we ship them pretty much any way we can. I will say this, however, that even though we can't launch from Goddard, Goddard actually does have its own launch facility. It's on the western shore of Virginia, Wallops Island. They're currently building the Mid-Atlantic Regional Spaceport. This August, they will be launching a payload from the east coast of Virginia to the moon. It's a mission called Laddie. So those of you online who are living in the East Coast, you will probably be able to see it. We will have the capability to put a couple 100 kilograms on the moon from Virginia within the next several months. So they're actually going to be doing a test launch of that launch vehicle probably in mid-April is what they're shooting for. So that'll be exciting.
All right. Our next question is, what is your favorite thing about working at NASA?
I think the best thing about working at NASA is the variety of work that you do. So Goddard will work on Earth science missions and space science missions, and through the course of your career you might work on a very large spacecraft, you might work on a small instrument, you might work on a laser altimeter, you might work on a microwave instrument. The work is always changing. Unlike sometimes you hear stories, I've had friends who've worked in the aerospace industry where they kind of get put into a box of doing one type of thing. You're going to be doing analysis on an electronics box, and here's our electronics box. The nice thing about working at NASA is that the missions always change. We are not doing the same thing over and over again. If we're going to be doing the same thing over and over again, to be honest, that's something that industry should be doing. The government should be doing that. Most of what we do is one-of-a-kind, unique stuff. It makes it really hard to do, but it also makes it really, really fun to do.
All right. Speaking of careers, do you see people generally spending their entire career at NASA?
That's a good question. I will say it's to be determined right now. I think there are a large number of people who spend their entire career at NASA, or if they don't spend their career specifically at NASA, they retire from NASA, they join a contractor, and then they work for NASA through the contractor, or vice versa. We've seen that both ways. I think generally people who work at NASA are working there because they have a real enthusiasm for NASA. A lot of the people who work at NASA have always wanted to work in the space program, and so they are really engaged in their work, and they really want to be there. Now, what'll be interesting is that we've talked about a lot recently is that the newest generation coming in, you guys, we're told that you guys might change your jobs, a dozen times through your career. So how do we, as an organization, which kind of counts on people being there for years and years and years, how do we deal with that? How do we encourage the next generation to want to be as committed to working here? Because it takes a long time to really understand the processes and be able to do this work. It's not something that you can just pick up. So we really have a vested interest in making sure that this is work that people want to stay with for at least a long time. So that's one of the challenges that we have. But generally, you do see a lot of people who do want to spend their entire career at NASA and who have been, with NASA for 35 plus years and would work longer if they were able to.
All right, our next question is, what are some other favorite projects that you've worked on at NASA?
Oh, some of my favorite projects. Well, as you can tell, I'm very fond of SDO. I think one of my other favorite projects was a mission called IceSat. And IceSat was a laser altimeter that was looking at how the ice sheet depths around the Earth are changing due to climate change. That was really an interesting project in that it was one of the first where I was the lead of a subsystem, and it was a pretty complicated subsystem. And one of the things, and this is not going to sound like a reason for it to be a favorite project, is it was the first project that I was on where I broke stuff in testing. And I look back at that now and I realize that that's actually a really important thing to happen to an engineer as you're going through your career, to be able to go through a test or whatever and to fail, and for the sky not to fall down upon you because things failed. We broke some hardware in test. Actually, we broke the same piece of hardware twice in testing before we figured out how to do it right. But it was a test that was designed to do that. It was an engineering test unit, and we learned a lot from that. and I learned a lot about the people I worked with, and I learned the kind of people that make the best engineers. And they're the ones that when there's a problem, they don't point fingers, they say, okay, let's see how we can fix this. And it's always we. So that was one of my favorite projects for that, because it was really an interesting experience that taught me a lot about the engineering process.
So my question is, I assume there's a lot of different engineers that work on the SDO team. How do you guys resolve conflicts, different, I guess, views of the project? How do you guys resolve your conflicts?
So the question here was, there are a lot of disciplines that are working on these projects. So how do you resolve the different conflicts that will arise?
So that's a good question. I remember years and years ago when I started out in engineering, seeing a picture of, it was like an aircraft designed by a structural engineer, electronic engineer, and thermal engineer, and they all looked completely different because they were all focused on their discipline. It ultimately comes down to, the ultimate goal of the team is to get a product that does what it's supposed to do and meets all the requirements, and you have to do that. So those conflicts are resolved by focusing on that. What are the requirements? What are the goals that we're trying to achieve? And what's the best way to do that? That's when you really depend on a good lead engineer who can help moderate those discussions, because every engineer is going to have their own particular viewpoint on things and their own thought about how to do things best. But ultimately, you have to work as a team, because it's impossible to put these things together if you can't work as a team and if you can't trust your team members. So that's usually how those are resolved, by focusing in on what's the common goal that you need to accomplish, and usually those are resolved. It doesn't mean that everyone leaves happy, but at least everyone leaves with the equal amount of frustration and a project that works well.
Final question.
Do you generally stay, have you only been working on space or science satellites, or do you also get moved between other types of projects within NASA?
Okay. So our final question is, have you always stayed with science satellites, or have you moved between different projects within NASA?
I personally, it's been primarily science satellites. Some of them have been science satellites that have gone up on the space shuttle, so they've been associated with the manned space mission that way. But for the most part, it's science satellites. Though we do have people at Goddard who have done work in the manned space program. We're seeing a little bit more of that now as we're starting to get a lot of missions where we're planning to attach payloads to the space station. And so you see a lot more of interaction that way. Goddard also, one of the things that we did was we were responsible for all of the servicing missions for the Hubble Space Telescope, which meant that Goddard, as an organization, worked very closely with the astronauts. We essentially designed all the tools that the astronauts use, and so the astronauts would occasionally show up at Goddard to try out these new tools and tell us what was working and what wasn't. So we do have those sorts of interactions, but for the most part, Goddard is primarily science satellites, and that's pretty much what I've spent my entire career working on.
All right, well, I guess that wraps up our webinar. I'd like to personally thank you, Jeff, for presenting tonight. And for those of you at home, we'd greatly appreciate it if you could fill out the survey that will pop up in the video comments at the end of this webinar. So thank you again, Jeff, and have a wonderful night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.